All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Donna Doherty. I am the Director of JASA's Legal Services for Elder Justice, and thank you all for coming today and taking the time to attend this session of Improving Article 81 Guardianship. Before we get started, as you know, today we're going to go over the results of the survey that we had sent out almost a year ago and through the beginning of 2023 that many of you participated in and gave your thoughts and recommendations. And we're then going to break out into sessions, smaller sessions, just to get a little bit more information from you all so that we can put together a final report on this project as we go forward with the courts and with Project Guardianship to try to improve the lives of people in Article 81 Guardian. I want to introduce the subcommittee members who've been working so hard, and they'll wave, hopefully, so you know who we all are. The first is Tahaya Boswell, who is a data and evaluation manager at Project Guardianship. There she is, and she's going to be going over the results today, along with Denise Colon, who will wave there, who, as many of you may know, is special counsel for court-based interdisciplinary programs at the Office for Justice Initiatives under the New York State Unified Court System. Then Kimberly George is here, the president and CEO of Project Guardianship, and is part of the subcommittee members. Also, along with Judge Bernice Siegel, who can't be here today because she has an Article 81 guardianship hearing, who is, of course, many of you know, a justice for the 11th Judicial District in Queens. I'm not sure if Rebecca Leibowitz, I have many people on the screen, is here from her staff. She's the principal law clerk to Judge Siegel. And then finally, Dina, but not least, Dina Schwartz, who many of you know, who's the director of New York State Guardianship Initiatives at Project Guardianship. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tahaya and Denise. I'm going to ask that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or save them to the end. We will try to have a couple of minutes at the end to take questions, and we'll try to answer as much from the chat as we can. So with that, let's get started.
Okay, great. That's my cue. Good morning, everybody. I'll dive right in the interest of time. We have a lot to cover. I'll start just by giving a background on this subcommittee and the goals and the grant that we received to do this important work. In 2021, the Unified Court System, in partnership with Project Guardianship and JASA, was granted an Elder Justice Innovation Award by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Community Living. The goal of the grant is to improve outcomes for every New Yorker who is the subject of a guardianship case, to increase access to court services for all New Yorkers, and to modernize guardianship case operations. The key objectives of the grant are to, 1, conduct a thorough assessment of the state's guardianship system, 2, build a technological infrastructure for accurately recording data, 3, improve outcomes by making the judicial process more efficient and encouraging less restrictive options, 4, provide accessible channels for guardianship subjects to communicate with court and court examiners, 5, develop and implement mandatory training programs, and 6, develop a process to monitor our system by improving communication channels between court personnel and court-appointed fiduciaries. 4 subcommittees were immediately formed to accomplish these goals: the Statewide Stakeholders Assessment Subcommittee, the Training and Education Subcommittee, Legal Forms and Documents Subcommittee, and the Data Enhancement Subcommittee. The statewide stakeholders assessment subcommittee developed the survey that many of you completed and will be the subject of today's discussion. This subcommittee is tasked with conducting a statewide assessment of New York State's current guardianship system, looking at fairness, effectiveness, timeliness, and the safety and integrity of guardianship. Next slide, please. As a first step, the subcommittee reached out to several stakeholder groups to inform them of the grant and elicit initial information, ideas about the current state of guardianship, and priorities for change. Included in these groups were WINGS, the Guardianship Roundtable, and the New York State Judicial Committee on Elder Justice. Thereafter, the subcommittee, working closely with the Unified Court Systems Department of Technology, began developing an online statewide survey that was comprehensive and included both general and stakeholder-specific questions, also allowing for written feedback. The survey was launched in October 2022, and between October and March of 2023, it was distributed throughout New York State to numerous stakeholders, including court staff, court clerks, judges, court attorneys, court examiners and evaluators, Part 36 fiduciaries and lay guardians, bar associations and nonprofit legal service providers, private attorneys, medical institutions, law school clinics, and community and government agencies, including community guardian programs and adult protective services. 985 people, representing 26% of the individuals who received the survey, responded. The results are in the initial report and will again form the basis for our discussion today. The feedback derived from the structured conversations taking place today will be incorporated into the final report. Next slide, please. The survey respondents. The stakeholder respondents were from all areas involved in the guardianship process and are included in this chart. Questions were broken down between court and non-court stakeholders. Because friends and family have a unique role, depending on the questions, they were grouped either with non-court staff or court-related staff. Next slide, please. The survey questions were broken down into specific areas, including their stakeholder roles, challenges they experienced, and supports and resources they believe would improve the process. Questions covering uniformity and collaboration were also included. Questions were designed to elicit information on relevance, impact, and need. Next slide, please. Most stakeholders answering the survey, in fact, 74%, consider themselves knowledgeable or very knowledgeable about guardianship proceedings. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Tahaya, who will continue with the reporting of the results.
Thank you, Denise. That was a wonderful introduction. So continuing with the actual data summary, as Denise said, the stakeholders that responded to the survey are very knowledgeable, rate themselves as very highly knowledgeable in this area. However, when we look at the perceived knowledge of others, those considering filing for guardianship, that number drops. So a majority of people believe that people considering filing are actually not knowledgeable about Article 81 or its alternatives. Everyone was asked this question. Interestingly, when we asked just the court-related staff, and that's that third group Denise mentioned, where it is court staff plus high users of the court, such as family and friends, only 8% of that group believe that people who consider filing for guardianship are knowledgeable on the topic. So there's definitely a discrepancy in expert users of the system and people who are filing for their loved ones. And these sorts of gaps in knowledge lead to major challenges for court-related staff. The lack of knowledge court users have means that court-related staff, again, people who are utilizing the court highly, are tasked with getting the court user to understand Article 81 generally, determining if it's an appropriate path, and walking them through the complex forms that they will need to submit to the court. It's important to note here that respondents could choose more than one response here. It was a multi-select, and many people did. So these 4 choices at the bottom, the most frequently chosen options here, were often chosen in tandem. So if a person was choosing one of these 4, they were also likely to choose one of the other 3 at the very least. And a lot of people actually chose all 4 of these as the biggest challenge. So that includes the amount of time it takes to assist people seeking help, helping the court user understand and complete the legal forms, helping the court user understand the appropriateness of Article 81 application, and lack of familiarity with the subject matter, lack of understanding of what guardianship will accomplish. So as you can see, it's a pretty strong theme developing here that people who are considering filing for guardianship need a lot of assistance throughout the process. And that's a major challenge for people who are working between the courts and the court users. This question asks, what are the biggest challenges you or your agency face in Article 81 Guardianship Matters? This was asked specifically for the non-court staff. So these are people such as nonprofits, community guardianship programs, etc. The non-court group's biggest challenge is the cost and fees associated with guardianship proceedings. It's very interesting to see the difference here, far and above the cost and fees. This can be an especially huge burden for lay guardians who make up 28% of the non-court staff group. We can also see that inadequate resources and supports are not far behind, right here. Same with how guardianship will function after appointment of a guardian. So this goes back to those knowledge questions we just went over. A lot of people seem to be confused about what will happen next. Maybe I can get through, the first phase of the forms, but I'm not quite sure about how this will unfold for my loved one. So this question was asked of everyone, and I thought it'd be interesting to see a comparison of the court group and the non-court group. The question was, what do you see as the biggest challenges in Article 81 guardianship proceedings? So the most chosen challenge, as you can see here in the middle, was the volume and time it takes to complete guardianship proceedings in court. That was named the single biggest challenge for everyone. There is a slight difference between the court group and the non-court group. So the court group agrees that this is the biggest challenge, but not to the same degree as the non-court group does, which, if you think about it, makes a bit of sense, because when you're not involved in the court system regularly, these delays and the volume and the time can weigh on you a bit differently. You have different pressures coming from the community. Excuse me. But it's interesting to see the agreement about this being the absolute biggest challenge. The next biggest challenge was the lack of trained quality guardians available for appointment. That one was about even between the court and non-court group. And then lastly, the difficulty with court forms and other documents. Again, we have a bit of a discrepancy here where the non-court group is actually reporting this as a higher, a bigger challenge than the court group. And again, that makes a bit of sense too. The court staff has an expertise in dealing with more complex forms because they do that on a daily basis versus someone who does this regularly, but perhaps is not as immersed in it. Or if you're a lay guardian or helping out a loved one, you're really not familiar with these forms at all. And it can be anything from the uniformity of said forms to the actual language contained in the forms. Moving on to referrals. So the highest referred, excuse me, area is private attorneys. So people who are referring people seeking information or help with guardianship, definitely refer these people to private attorneys above all other resources. This is especially interesting because we just learned that cost and fees were the biggest challenge for non-court group users. And so private attorneys, as we know, are quite expensive. And so these issues are starting to become interconnected, and we can see how they influence one another. The second most referred place is the courts and the court website. And this is important to note because we know that people are going directly to the source to find information. And therefore, it's important for us to make sure that the information is clear, it's easy to read, easily accessible, because there are a lot of people that are being directed to the courts as well as the court website. Supports and resources. So some of the most desired resources to improve guardianship proceedings involve training guardians, which is here at the bottom. Partnerships with referral agencies to help clients, which is here, this third one from the bottom. And ongoing training and education goes with this bottom one here. And then the fourth from the bottom, state funding for nonprofits to provide guardianship services. This is interesting because these top two, this was also a multi-select asked of everyone. So you can choose more than one option here. These two options around training guardians were chosen in tandem a lot. So people saw a connection between having more trained guardians and guardian supports, as well as ongoing training and education for lay guardians. So it's not just a sort of one solution fix we have going on here. We're thinking that we need training and education from all angles for everyone who is offering to be a guardian for someone else. And this, if we add up these two bottom ones here, the most frequently chosen resources, that is about 31% of stakeholders saying that that is the most needed resource. As for resources people already use, this was actually a qualitative question. So we asked people to free response resources that are currently in place that play an instrumental role in helping them address the needs of court users. The main theme here was actually a lack of resources. So here in the bottom right, we see we only have a lawyer willing, and we have to pay every time we have a question, which also goes back to that prohibitive cost factor. Up here on the top right, we have another quote. Unfortunately, there are limited agencies that can guide persons who need to constitute guardianship proceedings. And that touches on the theme we saw around partnerships and wanting more programs that can assist people who are seeking guardianship or thinking about guardianship. Over here on the top left, we have the local bar association, the court help desk, but that's about it. There are basically no resources in place to help us address the needs of court users trying to navigate guardianship proceedings. And finally, on the bottom left, for laypersons requiring assistance with filing, a private attorney is often beyond their financial means. Uniform forms, perhaps streamlining the process, may help in the long term, but the immediate needs will only be met by increased staffing. So there are a couple issues kind of captured in this quote, one of them being staffing, which gets to that high volume that we talked about before being a main stressor for both court and non-court groups. Uniform forms, as well as a private attorney and the financial cost that comes with consulting a private attorney. One more slide on support and resources. So when we ask, instead of asking about bettering guardianship proceedings overall, we're asking about what resources would enable people to be more effective in providing guidance and information in their own work. Most people said user-friendly forms and directions would be the most helpful, and that was followed by partnerships with agencies that would be able to provide help, and that was followed by more court staff. So you can see a couple of things starting to develop, and they're pretty strong throughout all of the responses. So again, we have these forms that would be very helpful for streamlining processes, partnerships to send people who need more help with different complex parts of the system, and more court staff to reduce the volume to take the pressure off of the system overall. Uniformity. So as I said, there was a strong theme around uniformity, but it wasn't just for forms, it was also around a data tracking system. So if we look here on the right first, we'll see that most people believe it will be very helpful if we had a statewide uniform data tracking system to provide at a glance information about Article 81 guardianship cases. So that's about 75% of court-related stakeholders who believe that this data tracking system would be beneficial in some way. So that's adding up the very helpful, the crucial, and the somewhat helpful categories, 3/4 of people. And then here on the left, we talk about uniform forms a little bit more. So 65% of stakeholders believe that creating and implementing uniform statewide forms would be extremely helpful. And so that's adding up the very helpful and the crucial categories. That number jumps up to 86% when we consider how many people believe uniform forms statewide would be helpful at all. So then we're adding in that somewhat helpful and helpful but not necessary. That's a lot of people. That's the majority of people, the vast majority. So these themes are supported not only by survey responses, but also with what stakeholders are saying in their free responses. These two forms of information are really reinforcing one another. And to that effect, here are some quotes from the free responses around uniformity in forms. So at the bottom here, we see form completion is intimidating. Sample forms would be helpful. To the top left, we see the online forms available in the different departments are inconsistent, and full sets of all forms are not available in all departments. On the top right, we have, I think there needs to be a clear online system that tells you exactly the status of the process and has clear updated forms available on one site. So we see this desire and need for consolidation of information, as well as uniformity across the state, across different departments, across different counties. And of course, the sample forms would be helpful, I think, is a great quote to include because it's a very specific ask. And I think that's something that a lot of the quotes had, and it's something that we'd all love to hear from you today. That's the point of this presentation and this time together, is to get a little bit more pointed on the things that are needed and what we can do to achieve them. And finally, the last topic was around collaboration, and that's collaboration between different stakeholders. So it's not presented here, but in the data we asked about how often you would like to meet with stakeholders to talk about how to better Article 81 guardianship and different issues and things of that sort. And one of the responses was, I am already a part of such a group. Only 2% of stakeholders reported that they were already part of such a group in which they could talk about guardianship issues and things of that nature. So that's a very small percentage. However, there are a lot of people that are wanting to have these conversations. So most people are willing to meet either quarterly or monthly to talk about these things and really capitalize on the energy we have going here and make things better all around, not only for people who are working in the system, but of course the people that have guardians that we serve at the end of the day. Moving on to these more specific questions, excuse me. we have here about the format for education and training materials. And here at the bottom, we can see that the most frequent was online and hard copy pamphlets and materials. I think that's important to note because that means that we are looking for resources that can be disseminated widely, easily accessed, and can walk people through it and take the burden off of kind of going through things step by step with people live. If we have some information that gives them a baseline understanding, going back to those knowledge questions at the beginning of the presentation, then we can free up some of our time to do things like live training sessions, short videos, things of that sort, and take the pressure off of the system in general. Maybe things will become a bit more efficient. So we also have some training sessions and videos, as I mentioned, as wants for formats for education. There are slight differences between non-court and court groups, but overall the trends remain the same, that the easily disseminated materials are preferred, but there is still strong support for things like videos and training sessions and seminars. And unsurprisingly, I think here to the right, we have what format would you prefer for meetings, which, as I said, most people are definitely in favor for. And most people would like that to be remote, over half, and some people are also willing to do hybrid and in person. I think leaning toward remote with a hybrid option will probably make people the happiest, but there seems to be a really great energy about collaboration. I think that is reflected in how many people we have here today wanting to engage in this discussion and give more information, and we should just carry that forward. And so to summarize everything that we went over, it was a lot of information in a short amount of time, but there are a few key takeaways that I think we can discuss more in relation to the questions that we'll ask in just a few minutes. And the first point, the guardianship process and its proceedings are long, complicated, and variable, and that creates challenges for those using the system and those who help users of the system. And a really big reason for that is that within the system, people are very knowledgeable. Once you're using a system daily or almost daily, you gain an expertise. However, outside practitioners are usually not. If you have no consistent interaction with this system, it is quite daunting. There is also a lack of resources and support. That was a very strong theme throughout both the qualitative and the quantitative responses. The highest needs involve more trained guardians to serve, increased uniformity throughout the state system. So not only the forms, but also data tracking and being able to see the case or the status of a case. And program partnerships to help people in need so that we're getting people the help that they need without sort of bogging down the system, trying to do too much with too little resources. The fourth point is that guardianship proceedings are expensive, and although private attorneys are the most utilized resource for referrals, many people cannot afford them. The cost is very prohibitive. Guardianship costs and fees are a significant burden for many, but especially for lay guardians. And lastly, most stakeholders are not meeting to discuss these issues regularly, as I just mentioned, but they are open to doing so, which is obviously demonstrated here. This, I think, inspires hope for improving the system, and I thank everyone who filled out this survey and is here today, because this is all really valuable information that isn't just going off into the ether for you to never hear about again, but actually makes real changes in people's lives in the system that we all work in. So that's a summary of everything we went over data-wise.